Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to transform this cheap little tray that I got from Hobby Lobby into something that's going to look something like this. That was my inspiration for this piece and I am so obsessed with how this turned out. I can't wait to share this technique with you guys. To prep our wood piece, we're going to start by lightly sanding it. Anything between a 60 to 220 grit will be fine. We just want to knock off any kind of oils or surface debris or any kind of pokey bits from the wood, splinters, stuff like that. Once we've sanded everything smooth, I'm going to clean it with some rubbing alcohol and paper towel, and then we're going to remove any excess debris with some linseed tack cloth. As long as you don't press too hard with your tack cloth, you're not going to leave any kind of oils that will disrupt your epoxy later. Once our wood is fully prepped, we're going to start by mixing 60 milliliters of my Flynn Sisters Artist Cure epoxy. Normally, before we pour on the epoxy for a piece like this, I would seal the wood with a very, very thin coat of my Flynn Sisters Fast Cure. That'll just seal in any kind of imperfections on the wood or anything that'll off gas later to affect my flood coat. But because this is a small kind of cheaper piece, I'm not really worried about that. I'm going to pour directly onto the wood today. But just keep that in mind if you are doing a larger piece. If the wood is treated or sealed, of course you probably don't need to do this, but this is a very cheap piece of wood. If it was a larger piece, I absolutely would do that first initial very, very thin coat to seal everything in. All right. But anyway, once I've poured my 60 milliliters of epoxy on here, I'm going to use gravity to roll the epoxy edge to edge as well as I can. And then for everything else, I'm going to spread it out with my stainless steel butter spreader. I love these stainless steel butter spreaders, both for mixing epoxy and for spreading. I'm going to link them down below. I've used them in my shop for years and they're fantastic. Anyway, once we've got our epoxy spread smoothly from edge to edge on our piece, I'm going to hit it with my torch to pop any bubbles. And then while the epoxy is still wet, we're going to use some glass shards to create some texture along what will kind of be the shoreline, I guess, of the colorful island in the middle of this piece. Think of the texture that we're creating here with these glass pieces as the guideline for where you want the green and blue part of your design to be and the border of where the wood's going to start. We want to create this texture because it's going to be used in the painting distressing that we're going to be using later. And the more texture that we have along our boundary line, the better. If you don't want texture poking out of your final piece, you can use a much smaller medium to create this type of texture, either with maybe a chunky glitter, or you could use maybe clean craft sand, or just something that's going to create that kind of rough texture along the edges. You're going to see why this is important later. Once I've positioned all my glass pieces in stones how I want them, I'm now going to introduce some brown alcohol ink into the wet epoxy around the shoreline and just here and there. I want this brown alcohol ink to almost look like burl, I guess, in the wood, or just kind of add some interest to it. I want this to look like something a little more special than just plain wood grain. Okay, so I'm just kind of adding to daubing the wet alcohol ink into the epoxy with a silicone brush here and there. If you wanted to create more organic movement with your ink in that epoxy, you can grab your heat gun and kind of hit it with your heat gun for a little bit to move it around, add some kind of dimension. You can also at this time mix in some kind of mica colors with your epoxy and put that inside what will be the colored area later, because once we remove the distressed paint, anything you see underneath is going to shine through. So if you wanted to have some kind of sparkly micas flowing through that middle section, I wanted more of an organic look for mine, so I'm going to leave out any kind of sparkle really. But just to kind of give you an idea of what you could do in which stage of this technique to create the layers and the depth that we're after. Once I was done applying the alcohol inks, I let that dry overnight before we moved on to the next step. Now that my piece is fully dry, I'm going to tape off the sides with some masking tape because now we're going to start on the paint distressing. I've used this technique in a couple of my most recent videos, so if you guys watch some of my videos, you'll be familiar with this one. So we're going to tape off all the areas that we definitely don't want paint. So the sides, the back, we're going to tape off some of that kind of shoreline area, but we don't want to tape off too much from that center portion or around our texture that we created with our glass, because we're going to need some of that paint there. All right, so after we get this all masked off, I'm going to take it over to my paint booth and we're going to do a very thin layer of flat black spray paint. It's important that you use a flat black. I'm using ColorShot's flat black paint. I love it. And as soon as that's dry to the touch, I'm going to go over it with a very generous coat of Rustoleum 2x flat white paint. Again, it's very important to use flat white paint for this technique. Once that's dry, if you feel like you need to add a second light coat of the white, you can, but we really do want to make sure we have a nice solid layer of that white. As soon as that was fully dry to the touch, I removed all the masking and now we're ready to move on to the paint distressing. I've got an old rag here and I have a pump bottle with some acetone, and I also have some 91% rubbing alcohol in my spray bottle. And I'm going to start with some acetone on my rag here, and I'm going to go ahead and start removing all of the large sections of paint that we definitely don't want. It's important to not go too far into our center section with the acetone because we cannot add more once we've taken it away. Okay, so we want to remove very conservatively at this stage of the game. You'll see that when I do kind of move into that section, I try to angle my finger or swirl around the rag to create some more texture around the line that I'm creating. And then when I go in to clean it up with the 91% alcohol, that's going to clean up all of that excess paint along the clean edge and along the painted sections. If you're finding that you're having a hard time removing the excess paint with the 91% rubbing alcohol, move on to a cleaner section of the rag and apply more elbow grease. Be very careful though if you use the same glass that I did along those shorelines. Make sure you're wearing gloves and make sure that you're not rubbing your fingers directly along those glass shards, as you could really hurt yourself. If you have to kind of bunch up the rag to put some cushion between your hand and those shards, that's kind of what I did to make sure I didn't get hurt. So you're just going to repeat this technique all the way around your piece, or anywhere that you want to remove the paint to expose more of the wood grain underneath, and also just create more texture and dimension along that edge. You'll see what I mean, how that stuff that we put in underneath creates such a cool look above as we're removing more and more of that paint. I'd also like to add that this looks really tedious and like it took me a long time, but in actuality, this took in total 20 minutes of hands-on time for me to do all of the paint distressing. And it actually, in the end, looks like it took me way longer. Here's the finished look once I was completely done with the paint distressing. And now I was ready to move on to my alcohol inks, which is how I'm going to be painting in this island of our piece. I've already added my alcohol inks to my palette. I will list the colors that I use down below. You guys know I use these very frequently on my channel. They're my favorite medium. And just with like some cheap paintbrushes, I'm going in and daubing color to some of my larger sections, and then to some of the more delicate detailed areas, I'm just very carefully painting in with a finer point of my brush. To extend that color section and kind of blow it up, I'll just daub it with just some clean rubbing alcohol from my clean cup. By clean cup, I mean I've got a little medicine cup there filled with just 91% rubbing alcohol. And I kind of balance the color on my brush and the saturation with that 91% rubbing alcohol. Then we'll dab it on the paper towel to kind of take off any excess. And then we go into our piece and apply the color. I will list and link all the alcohol ink colors that I used down below in the description box. I'm going to move through the body of my piece with mostly teal color. That's like the primary color that I was getting from my inspiration piece. So we're going to do that for almost all of the little island here. And then once I'm satisfied with my teal sections, I'm going to move into the navy blue. This color is called Bachelor buttons. And again, I'm just introducing that color the same way I did the teal. And then where the two sections of color meet, we'll go in with a clean brush and just some rubbing alcohol and try to blend them together. If you want like a more intense blend, add a little bit of ink to that blending brush, and that'll give you kind of more of a blended look. With the rubbing alcohol, it kind of just marries the colors together. Sometimes it'll separate them. That's the fun part about alcohol inks, is it's very unpredictable. It's a little bit abstract, and you can't be too obsessive about where you want things. You have to kind of go with the flow, and I just kind of let the inks show me where they need to be added, or where I think they should be added based on the kind of depth that I'm trying to create for the piece. I hope I articulated that okay. All right, so after we've got all the inks on there and I'm happy with how everything looks with the saturation and stuff, don't mess with it too much, because the more you mess with it, the more we risk getting some of the ink into the wood sections. And before we close up shop today, you really want to make sure that you go through all of the clean wood sections where we don't want any paint and any ink, and really double down on cleaning that up with some rubbing alcohol and a clean paper towel. And just keep looking at the paper towel to see if you've picked up anything until it's totally clean, because anything that's stuck there once we're done with the painting process is going to be locked in after we epoxy over it. Once I've got all my alcohol inks laid down and I'm happy with the look, I'm going to go over everything along the edge with a Posca acrylic paint marker in black fine point. And I want to add in some details along the island edges. We can add in some like veining and stuff, add in some lines to what kind of look like mountains with those larger stones. Whatever you want to do with that black, but this is kind of going to buffer everything and cover up any kind of mistakes. If you've left any kind of white parts, or you didn't want to get too close to the shoreline with that ink because you were afraid of getting it into the wood, you could just leave a little bit of the white and color that in with the black, and it's going to make everything blend in really nice and smooth. So definitely lean into that black marker to help you clean up any mistakes. Once we were done creating this masterpiece, I was finally ready to remove that masking tape, make any corrections that I needed to make there, and then I did let this sit overnight. I always let my alcohol inks dry for 12 to 24 hours because I do not like to seal them. Any kind of sealer that has ketones in it, or even acrylic sealers, I risk changing the colors of those inks, and I just don't like to risk it. So let them dry on their own, and now I'm ready to apply my final coat of epoxy. I've mixed 80 milliliters of my Flynn Sisters Artist Cure, and I went ahead and just poured it right over the top. Notice I don't have any masking tape or anything. I'm just going to very carefully trust myself to not make any mistakes here. But we really want to spread that epoxy edge to edge. Anything that I can't get with gravity, I'm going to use my butter spreader to just spread it all the way to that edge. Also want to pay careful attention to the rocky points where the stones come up. If I need to pour any kind of additional epoxy over those just to make them less sharp, this was definitely helpful to dull them a little bit and make sure nobody gets hurt if they happen to run their hands across this, okay? Also keep in mind, if there's texture on it and you want to place something flat over the top, it's not going to sit flat over the top, okay? So just keep that in mind. But anyway, once I got this all applied, I'm going to hit it with my torch to pop any remaining bubbles. And then I'm going to let this sit to dry overnight before we were ready to move on to the next step. And really, there is no next step because that's it. We were done. Look how simple this was. I mean, yeah, you have to do some painting and a little bit here and there and some finagling, but this technique is pretty foolproof. I love how this turned out. I made a larger one. I use this to keep my fish tank supplies in, and it is absolutely beautiful in my home. Let me know what you guys thought about this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. I upload new videos every week, or at least when I have time. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again soon. If you loved that last video, you can check out the next one here, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok for more great content. You can shop our products at FlynnSistersSupplyShop.com and subscribe to our channel for new videos every week. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you again soon.